Here is Ian Riddler talking about our bone working. Take it away, Ian.
Right, okay. I'm going to try and see if I can get this working now. I need to get the share thing working first, don't I, with you?
Yep. So if you remember, it's next to the microphone button.
Yeah, it's kind of gone a bit grey, saying only meeting organisers and presenters can share.
Okay. One second. Let me see if I can figure out. Jen, around, you can jump in to help me here. Figure out how to give you that permission.
Ah, that's it.
Yeah,
that's
hi,
it.
Brandon. I've just
That's
checked.
it. You got it.
Thank you.
Here we go. Here we go. That's it. Right. Let's see. Hang on. There we go. Is that okay?
It's still loading on my end. Yep, I can see it.
All right. Yep. Yep.
Right, take it away.
Here we go. I think. Yeah, this is just loading up. There we go. There we go. Right. Good. Okay. When I first started working on this material a very long time ago, in the mid 1980s at Southampton, I was working on Hamwic material with this sort of material, in fact. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, I have to say, really. Phil Andrews had just finished excavating at Six Dials, and Alan Morton was putting together all the material from the earlier sites for his volume. And at the same time, we had Matt Garner out digging the new sites as we were going along. And Richard Hodges had produced Dark Age Economics just a couple of years before. So we had a kind of framework to work with as well. And at the same time that we were doing our work, Lundenwic had just been discovered. So there was a frenzy of activity about that site and about, you know, people digging holes there as quickly as they could almost. And in a rather more leisurely way, over in Ipswich, you had Tom Loader and Keith Wade, who'd been starting to dig sites in 1974 in the centre of Ipswich, but were building up, and by the mid 80s they were building up to doing the big site at the Butter Market. So this was, I think this was probably the best time really for the Emporia, and you could argue that ever since then it's been a slow and steady kind of decline in interest in them and in assessing their significance and in putting them into Middle Saxon England. And there are various kind of watershed moments, like the beginning of the Portable Antiquities scheme in 1996, which was, you know, a great thing in its own right, undeniably so. But it had the effect of kind of shifting the arguments to the rural environment and away from the urban environment. So thereafter, there's been a huge amount of, you know, good research on unstratified metal objects from the rural environment, all of which is wonderful, but it's not really done us much good in terms of the Emporia. And you can probably tell I am very much a Hamwic man and have been all my life, really. And so we felt that probably the lowest point was 2011 with, which is this book here, the Oxford Handbook of Anglo-Saxon Archaeology, where there really wasn't much on the Emporia at all. There wasn't an article devoted to them. There was just a couple of pages and a kind of article that Tim Pastel wrote. And Tim, you know, lovely man, by his own admission, he's not an Emporium person, really. And then you had a little bit from Richard Hall, thank goodness, and something also from Gabor Thomas. And I've taken this quote from Gabor here as well to be the kind of starting point from where I want to look at the wicks, and if you like, it's almost like the return of the Emporia as well. So Gabor's comment was that amongst the English wicks, it is only ironworking and potting that display evidence for production in fixed locales for sustained periods of time. And even in such cases, the consensus of academic opinion, which seemed to reference Chris Scull, I think, for the opinion there, favours seasonal or intermittent production. So that's I think that's my sentence that I want to take a look at in respect of material from both Hamwic and Ipswich, and to a certain extent using Hamwic to inform us about Ipswich, and using Ipswich then towards the end to inform us about Hamwic, as the two work together actually quite well. It has to be said that in this quote you can get rid of the seasonal thing now. Almost as Gabor was writing that, you had Dagfinn Skray was looking at what defines seasonality in these big Anglo-Saxon and continental emporia, and under the criteria that he came up with, which have been refined and I think taken on a bit by Sarah Qua more recently in the last few years, it's clear that the 4 English emporia are permanent from the beginning, from the very beginning. So the seasonal end bit, you can take that out now really, but the intermittent part and the do we have these fixed locations for these production episodes, you know, that's the important thing that we need to look at. Now, in the sort of material that I deal with, which is bone and antler, work bone and antler from Anglo-Saxon England, you need to know what you're dealing with in terms of the finished product. So this is simply a diagram of the quantities of Middle Saxon objects of this material from Ipswich, and you can see it is very restricted. Combs are the dominant single item there. Most of those are made of antler, and then if you bundle all the textile manufacturing equipment together, that's the other big thing really. And you have pin beaters, spindle. Sorry?
I'm not sure if I can see we can see the presentation or the diagram you're referring to. On my screen anyway, I can only see your title slide.
Oh boy, hang on, I'll move about here. Can you see a different slide now?
Not on mine.
Oh, right.
Maybe
okay.
Oh, I can see it moving now.
Yep. So if I hang on, let's try this again to see if it goes. Can you see that?
No.
No. And what I might do then, that, but you can see that.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I can see that.
I think maybe what I can do is, if you can see that okay, I can work with that and go down through the slides like that, and hopefully you can see those okay. You can see this kind of quote on the slide there. Yep, good. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So if I go down here, can you see? You can see that okay?
Yeah, I can see that fine.
Ah, good. We'll work with this. So there you have combs, mostly made of antler, pins, bone and antler, textile manufacturing equipment, mostly made of bone, and that's how it works. And this is the most restricted period of the Anglo-Saxon period. There are more object types in the early Anglo-Saxon period and more object types in the late Saxon period. And in the Middle Saxon period, it becomes very restricted in terms of the finished object. Now, this is a plan of Ipswich. Well, we'll start here to show you really, in a sense, what's good and what's bad about Ipswich. This is the 32 sites here that Tom Loader and Keith Wade excavated over that 20-year period. Mostly they're just dots there, and then the bigger sites are in the grey blobs that are slightly larger there. And hopefully you can see that you have a settlement in the yellow, which is both north and south of the river, and the new volume on Stoke Quay has actually really emphasised the importance of the settlement on the south side of the river now as well. And the way that Ipswich seems to work is that the early focus, which is what they call the early Middle Saxon period, or EMS period, which is 600 to 670 roughly, well, that seems to be a certain amount of land immediately to the north of the river, and then this material at Stoke Quay and beyond down the south of the river. And then when you get to the sort of Ipswich wear phase, which is, it's difficult to say, but 670 to 700, then going on to 870, the place expands in size, and you get the green up there, which is the potteries in the northeastern corner. The size of the original ENS settlement is debated really. It's been put as low as 6 hectares and as big as 35. And I think it's somewhere between those two. Stoke Quay has reaffirmed the fact that it's on both sides of the river. And so it may be around about 20 or so hectares, something perhaps like that. But it incorporates a site which I hope you can see, which I'm just going to try to point to here, which is Greyfriars Road there. And that's a key significant site for Ipswich and for particularly for my work and for this period. It has the only assemblage from any of the emporia of worked antler and bone that you can date securely into this EMS period. This is in terms of the waste materials. And here they are on this particular site. This is the southern part of the site. It's about a quarter of the actual excavation, but all the bone and antler comes from this southern transect. So I'm concentrating on that area. And in the orange there, you have the location of basically 2 episodes of production in this period, put in fact into the backfills of sunken feature buildings. So that's 125 and 437, and there's also a pit there which has a little bit of waste as well. And these are small production episodes. There's only about 20 fragments of waste in the big one and about a dozen in the other one. And this is what's kind of good and what's bad about Ipswich. It's good that we have this early material. It's the only site that has this. But the difficulty is that we don't know where the building or buildings are, where this material is actually being worked. We can't tell. It's in part because there are so many pits in this kind of lunar landscape that you see there. So many pits come in during the Middle Saxon and then Late Saxon and then medieval periods, and they're really destroying the Middle Saxon archaeology. So it's hard to pick up the buildings. It's very, very hard. It's a very crowded landscape, if you like. And also it's quite perfectly possible, and this seems to be, it was almost one of the kind of signatures of Keith and Tom, that they, as you can see with this site, they would find buildings right on the edges of their excavations, and so they would then have to, you know, expand to take in a building, and things seem to be happening just off their sites, because it is obviously a very dense kind of landscape anyway. So what you have there is sort of classic sort of thing that Gabble's talking about, the intermittent production episodes in a building which is maybe located where the caption is for this slide, or somewhere around there, and then the materials being deposited into the backfills of buildings that have gone out of use. This is not workshops or anything like this. This is domestic life with a little bit of craft production on an intermittent scale. So it's exactly what he's talking about, really. This is a diagram of textile manufacturing equipment across that landscape as well, and you can see the big orange blobs are 2 or 3 kilos each of loom weights, and they cluster around building 125 as well. So it suggests that there's also weaving going on in and around that structure, but not in that structure, but in this putative structure that is somewhere near it, and it's then deposited nearby. But that's as far as we can get to a certain extent. We don't get it much further with it, and that's one of the frustrations of dealing with Ipswich, is actually locating the sites, the specific structures where this is happening. If we then go into the Middle Saxon period, this is kind of Ipswich ware period, if you like. Frustrating thing about that is that Ipswich ware has such a wide date range, from probably somewhere around 700, it's a bit up in the air at the beginning now, to around 870 or so. So that's 170 years, which in modern chronologies, that's way too long, really. But nobody has yet been able to cut it in half and to talk about early Ipswich ware as against late Ipswich ware. And, you know, we just hope, I hope that happens at some time in the future. This is the Middle Saxon material in the red, which is the later than the EMS material in the orange, but you can see it's in the same place. And if I showed you a diagram of the entire site, it wouldn't be anywhere else. It's just here. And this is, if you like, what we've called the static workshop in the forthcoming Ipswich volume that we're putting out. It's something that Gabble was just aware of when he was actually writing that text, and he did acknowledge it, the fact that once you start to get antler and bone waste in one place, it seems to stay there across the Middle Saxon period. It doesn't move that far. actually, yes, let me just come back. And just one more thing. I just want to show you that ditch that runs along the bottom, just above 125, is ditch 44, which is a wonderful ditch that we'll explore a little bit later on. Anyway, if you want to put structure and waste together, then the best place is undoubtedly Hamwic. I mean, Lundenwic's quite good, but Hamwic is just frankly brilliant for this sort of thing. And this is a map of Hamwic as it was. There have been a few more excavations since, but it shows you where the 6 styles excavations were that Phil Andrews undertook. And this is Phil's plan, rough plan of his structures, and there's 68 of them there. So it gives you plenty of structures to work with and a lot to do. But kind of before you can do it, you need to take a look at the phasing of both Ipswich and these other sites. Ipswich phasing on the top there running along, you can see the problem with the Middle Saxon phase being so long really compared to what is underneath it. Hamwic phasing was always a little better, and we started in the 80s. It was early, middle and late like that. 700 to 750, 750 to 850, 850 to 900. Nice and simple. It worked, but it wasn't quite right. And those of you that have read every page of Phil's volume will realise that quite a lot of the time when he's talking about this middle phase, he's splitting it in half. He's talking at things happening about before and after 800, if you like, which is roughly in the middle of that phase. You can also see that Hamwic phasing was influential on Fishergate York phasing, but that it's possible that once Lundenwic came in, and they have more ceramics to deal with and a better range of ceramics and very good people working on them too. That provided, as you can see, the inspiration for both Phil and I to look at Hamwic phasing again. There is an EMS phase for Hamwic now. It's the stadium cemetery. That is perfectly placed in that phase. And what we've then done is push the other phases a little bit earlier, about 20, 30 years earlier, based on the comparing Hamwic ceramics in particular with Lundenwic ceramics. And there are a lot of comparisons that you can make. There are other things you can bring into the mix as well, as I'll show you. But those work very well together. So that in the end, Hamwic, in its revised phasing now, has 5 phases, and it's usually a little bit earlier, except for the last phase, which definitely starts 850. Now, we don't have phase 1 assemblages from Hamwic to compare with phase 1 EMS from Ipswich, but we do have a goodly amount of phase 2. We've got currently, I have to say at this point, I'm still going through this material. It's we're 19,000 fragments down the line, but there's a lot more still to do. So I've mostly got the centre of 6 stars worked out, but the outer edges of it I'm still going towards at the moment. In this material, I don't know if you can see this on my desk, but this is today's assemblage, which is one of the late phase 5 ones we'll see in a minute. Phase 2 is defined by antler, the presence of antler. Usually, sometimes it's just antler waste, but other times, as you can see here, it can include animal rib and whalebone and a small number of horn cores as well. And currently we have 650 offcuts for this phase from 46 layers within 16 separate features. And the thing about Hamwic, much more so I think than any other site, is that layers are really important, because there can be up to 35 or so in any one pit, and a pit at Hamwic that just has 1 or 2 layers is almost unknown. I mean, they've all got 6, 7, 8, 9 layers, so the layer is the basic, it's the context, that's the basic unit that you're working with all the time. Now these was it 46 layers, 46 assemblages, if you like, from phase 2 are small. You can see that here I've just taken the 15 that have 10 or more offcuts in them, and the biggest is only just over 100 offcuts. So we're still in that, very much in that intermittent production scenario that Gabor gave us, I think, for this phase. This phase is roughly 8670 to 720 or so, so it's a 50-year phase. But you do have to be careful about just calling it intermittent. I mean, what does that mean? And this is perhaps a good illustration of that. Quantifying production is very difficult. I mean, anyone who's tried to do it for any material will know how difficult it is. But you can do something. This is an assemblage of 46 fragments of antler from one of those layers. Now, it has 2 burrs in it, so we know there's at least 2 red deer antlers. Here's a red deer antler. This is a very small red deer antler compared to an Anglo-Saxon one, but we know we're dealing with at least 2 antlers, but there are 4 crown offcuts actually running more or less through the middle of this assemblage here, and that means you've actually got 4 antlers. Now, how many combs can you make from an antler? The consensus is around either 3 or 4, and at Hamwic the antlers are quite small, so we'll say 3. So that's 12. This assemblage is roughly 12 combs. Obviously, other things were being made as well, but if you just stay with me for this is roughly 12 combs. You can actually see in the bottom right-hand corner waste from comb manufacture. And 12 combs, how long does it take to make a comb? It takes about 3 days. And if you're really good, and I'll show you some of the combs in a second, you can see why they take 3 days. They are quite complex things. So certainly you've gone 12 combs, 3 days, 36 days on this assemblage alone. So intermittent probably isn't the best word for this. Then you have to realise that at Hamwic, and indeed I think to a large extent at Ipswich as well, the excavation strategy was to section a pit, to dig out half of it, to then get a very good section of how the pit worked. Layer by layer you take each bit apart, but not to dig the second part. So this waste represents 50% of the pit being dug. So there is more. There was more in there. How much more we don't know, but suddenly you've gone from 36 days to maybe 40, 50, 60 days. So, and yet it's a relatively small assemblage of antler. So you need to be aware that intermittent could actually be, you know, quite a long period of time. Now these are the sorts of combs that were being produced in this phase. Double-sided composite combs were the main thing for Hamwic in this phase, and I've got 6 types of them, but they're all relatively similar to each other. The big differences really are between combs with fat teeth, as the French like to call them, and combs with fine teeth down there. And the fat teeth combs, 2, 3, 4 teeth per centimetre. The fine tooth combs up to 14 teeth per centimetre, which is each tooth less than 1 millimetre in width. Really accomplished combs. I mean, these are extraordinary combs to be able to make. And being so fine, the presumption must be that these are knit combs. If we then see how many we've got, you can divide them really into 3 categories, because there's a kind of normal of which is 5, 6, 7 teeth per centimetre comb as well. So there seem to be 3 groups with the possibility of a 4th there, and fine tooth combs are the most common at this particular time. I did something similar to this in Southampton a couple of years ago, and the first question I had afterwards was it just Hamwic where they had real problems with knits? And the answer is most definitely no. All the emporia have got fine tooth combs as well. It's just that Hamwic has got the biggest assemblage of them. What were they using the animal bone for? Well, curiously enough, actually to make the combs with as well. They form the connecting plates of single-sided composite combs like this one, which is a 6 dials comb. And these combs are very distinctive because they're so thin. They're not using antler, so their connecting plates are really thin. They're perfectly good combs, but they do have distinctive sections to them, and as a result of that you can find them quite easily amongst the Middle Saxon world, if you like. And this is the distribution of them as we know them so far, and you can see that they come from the Hamwic, Ipswich and York, but not yet from Lundenwic, which is a little bit curious. And then they come from sites that may have some relation to those particular emporia. Now, does that mean that we are trading combs at this early stage? It's a difficult question to answer, I think. It could be trade, it could be contact. And certainly where you see these combs turning up at Dorstadt and at Hessens in Frisia, that I think is contact. That is Anglo-Saxons on the continent in the period 670 to 720. Now, so the beauty of Hamwic is you can associate structure and waste, and here is structure 33 with structure 15 just not yet built on to the east of it there. And in the green blobs you have the waste in its quantities around that structure. This isn't the best example of this, but we'll see the best example in a minute. But it does show you how the waste is deposited around the structure, and you can see that there's the largest assemblage that we have from this period is up there. This again is slightly deceptive because that pit was hit by the pipe trench and only 10% of it survived, and the 100 fragments come from the 10%. But alongside those 100 fragments, they quite wisely, I think, decided to sample the pit and floated the whole lot. There were only 2 layers left in that pit. I think the uppermost layers had gone, but we got 100 fragments and also several kilos of shavings and smaller fragments of antler as well. So that really was a big focus, I think, as a working assemblage in that layer. This is where the phase 2 structures are located on 6 dials. There's a north-south street running just to the west of these buildings, and you can see that seems to be where they're wanting to be at this particular phase, with one building along the east-west street and what is not in effect a building but a pit up in the top corner there. The building itself would have been beyond the limits of excavation. But there we have 7 structures there which we can associate with the waste at this time. Now, if we move into the next phase, this is kind of the equivalent. This is 720 to 780. We're sort of in Ipswich, where phase A, if you like, rather than phase B. And it shows the assemblage of waste is quite different. It's really different. Antler has suddenly shrunk to 20%, and worked bone has become cattle metapodia. Beyond 80–90% of the bone is cattle metapodia now. And the reason for this is the advent of the handled comb, which was produced in both antler and bone. The top 2 here are antler combs and the bottom one is bone. And if I go back, insofar as you can get a lot of combs out of a little bit of waste with antler, it's almost the reverse with worked bone. That looks like a lot of worked bone waste, or a fair amount of it, with all these metapodia that, for example, I have here as well. But experimental work that I've done and other people have done suggests that you need either 2 or 3 metacarpals and a metatarsus to make one comb. So you're kind of 3 bones, 1 comb here, and so you very quickly get through all the metapodia that you've got in that diagram, and that is only there about 6 combs. So it's a different kind of way of looking at it in a way with bone to antler. Now, phase 3 assemblages are very much like phase 2 assemblages in that, in terms of their size, they're not big assemblages. Again, they're generally small, but there are a lot more of them. So far, 1,650 offcuts from 200 layers within 64 different features, and that is 2.5 times the amount of waste we had for the previous phase. But it's still, apart from a few at the end there that go over 100, it still seems like this intermittent production is going on. They're still producing the same sorts of combs, but in this diagram it's perhaps clearer that they're really sort of 4 separate classes by the fineness of their teeth now, rather than 3. But that is much as it was. But of course now they're also using the bone and antler, and particularly the bone, to make handled combs, and that's a huge difference because you start to see quite a lot of them. This is a kind of like pullback of a diagram for central 6 dials, and this is structure 15 in the middle there, which I published a cut down version of this diagram a few years ago when I coloured in all of the pits that the waste came from, and it rather gave the impression that the whole place was overloaded with waste, whereas in fact it's more like this. This is perhaps a better way to do it. There are lots of small assemblages there. and then an appreciable amount around structure 15. Structure 11 is starting down there. It was in the previous phase, and it's just starting to get a bit bigger there. And you have new introductions with 38 coming in there, and basically with more buildings, which is extraordinary, really. It's a fascinating thing. There are 9 there. I know there's another one now down the bottom there. So there are 10 buildings that I can associate with this phase so far, and the emphasis has changed completely to the east-west street, away from the north-south street. Whether this is the sons and daughters of the previous generation moving into other structures but carrying on the craft in its slightly changed form, with the handle comb becoming prominent, I don't know, but it seems to give you a sense that production is certainly increasing, but is still perhaps on that intermittent level. There's just an echo of this at Ipswich, but there are also differences. The handle comb area for Ipswich seems to be around the butter market, somewhere in that area, whereas Greyfriars Road, that we saw earlier, they're still only using Antler, and there are absolutely no sign of any handle combs at all. So they're not interested in producing handle combs in the southern part of Ipswich. And in a similar way, you see that in Lundenwic as well. They have no great interest in the handle comb in Lundenwic either. So there are differences between the emporia and the combs that they produce. Now in phase 4, we've reached 780 to 850 now, and at first sight this is much the same as the previous phase. You can see it's cattle metapodia, a few other bones as well there, but with the eye of faith you may now see that the proportion of antler is increased. It was 20 to 30% in phase 3. It's gone 30 to 40% now in phase 4, and the assemblages are bigger, and boy are they bigger. We now have 5,700 offcuts from fewer layers, only 126 layers, and only 55 features. But that is 2.5 times the amount that we had for the previous phase. And as you can see, a heck of a lot more of them are now over 100 offcuts. And then when you look at the structures, there are just 4 of them. The whole thing has come down into just 4 structures. And those 4 structures are phase 4, and they stay in phase 5 as well. They're the only structures that really stay for more than one phase. And these are workshops. These are proper full-time, right the way through the year workshops. And it seems to be controversial in a way. It seems no coincidence, if you like, that you have the workshop developing in Hamwic just at the time that the collective workshop is developing in Northern Europe. Anyway, phase 4, where are the double-sided composite combs? They have gone. They have all but gone. And this, I worked this out literally just last month. I was working out the phasing details for the combs. This was a bit of a shock, really, that we had so many double-sided composites before, and in phase 4 there are hardly any. And the double-sided composite comb has gone out of use in Hamwic by about AD 800. And if we look at Ipswich, we've compiled our Ipswich volume, which I'm glad to say is, you know, speeding towards its publication now, and we put all the double-sided composites from Ipswich together, and that's more or less all of them. There aren't many more than that. When we were going through them, they come from Middle and Late Saxon contexts, but we didn't seriously think that any of them were Late Saxon. We thought the whole lot was compressed into the Middle Saxon period, and then there were problems of residuality that it meant that some of them strayed into later contexts. Now we're wondering, you know, we had them going out of use around about AD 870. Now we're thinking maybe it's earlier than that. Maybe it's actually following Hamwic, and this comb type disappears at the beginning of the 9th century. Yeah, and the reason is probably, at least part of the reason, is probably to do with these combs. These are horn composite combs, which use bone or antler connecting plates. They look pretty terrible. This is one comb from York, 2 sides of the same comb from York. It's a very rare survival of horn in the ground, because horn disappears in the ground in days. It doesn't last very long at all. So you have to have anaerobic conditions for it to survive. And this looks like a fairly sort of battered comb, but you have to think beyond that to what it looked like when it was new. And you can buy horn combs nowadays. They're still made in Ireland. They're made in Morocco. They're made in a number of countries. And I bought one in Sweden just a couple of years ago, and they are lovely, lovely combs. They look a lot better than this, and they work extremely well. And you know, before we're too disrespectful of them, because the connecting plates are pretty awful, aren't they? But without being too disrespectful, I mean, they are a technological advance, because suddenly you've got fine teeth and coarse teeth on the same comb. And no earlier combs, they never mixed the two sets of tooth values on the Hamwic combs, or indeed on any other Middle Saxon double-sided composite comb. If you wanted those values previously, you had to have two combs. Now you've got it all in one comb. And the important, I think, and new evidence from Hamwic that I'm digging up is that this comb type, which is regarded basically as a late Saxon comb form, actually starts in the 9th century in phase 4 in Hamwic, in the latter part of the Middle Saxon period. Phase 5 is 850 and later, and it's dated entirely on coins, really, because there don't seem to be noticeable ceramic differences. There are subtle ones, but not. The others all have overt changes in ceramic types, but the phase 5 doesn't. It's a development of a sort beyond phase 4, in the sense that there's even more antler now. It's come up to about 50% of any one assemblage. And these are the assemblages themselves. It's a short phase, I think. I don't think it lasts before much longer than about 875, 880. We've got 2,900 fragments of waste from this phase, from 21 layers within 12 structures. And this material I have on the desk in front of me now is actually, this is the 12th one. This is the one I've been doing this week, actually, which is in fact slightly beyond the diagram I'm going to show you of where they all are. But the curious thing here is that you've got essentially the pattern that you had in phase 4. Fairly large assemblages, but not very many of them. And then you've got this whacking great assemblage at the back, 5261, from one pit, which is around 2,000 fragments of antler and bone in about roughly even numbers. Now, I have only scanned that assemblage. I have not yet worked on it. So in order to understand it, and why you get one assemblage that is so much bigger than all the others, we will go and have a look at Ipswich in a second. But first of all, just to show you where these assemblages are, in the centre of Hamwic, I should have inked in 15 and 38. They're the same two buildings, 17 and what is now 13 over there on the left. We're in the same place here. This new assemblage I have here is in fact way, way away from these. It's over in the top right-hand corner of Hamwic. It's another one. It crashes through building 29 as a well. A well is constructed around about 88, 58, 60, crashing through an existing building, so it must relate to another building that we don't actually have, that is beyond excavation. So it's starting to get into the Ipswich situation almost with those. How do you explain this massive assemblage, this one big assemblage? And I think the answer lies with this assemblage from Ipswich. To return to Greyfriars Road again, this is an assemblage of large fragments of antler that came out of that ditch 44. There are 400 fragments, and whichever way you look at it, this is big stuff. It's it includes all the production stages, so it goes from the very beginning right through to comb making at the end. But there are lots of big fragments of antler in here, and one way of demonstrating this is to say that the average weight of antler per fragment in Hamwic as a whole is around 6 grams. Ipswich, excluding this material, is around about 9 grams. 12th century Dublin, 10 to 12 grams. This material is 98 grams per fragment, so it's big. You know, there's no doubt that it's large pieces of material. And that I think means that it's a closure deposit. It's sort of the end of the game. They've stopped the workshop, you know, it's finished, and they've cleared it away into this ditch. Now the ditch was cut around about 8825, and so they're filling it 850 to 870, conceivably because they can see the Scandinavians coming, but equally well it could be 10 years before that. And one of the reasons, of course, that they're doing it could be much more to do with the material. It's red deer antler, and red deer antler is kind of going out of fashion as a raw material, because you're using horn and bone increasingly, and you're not making those elaborate double-sided composite cones anymore. That works up to a point, but the problem is, of course, you are making other forms of comb in antler as well, so it doesn't completely work as an answer. But this is a closure deposit, and I suspect that the material from that big pit, 2,000 fragments from, is exactly the same. It's the end of the game there, and that is happening in that particular case. That's a pit with a coin in it of 8850. It's happening 860, 870, and all these assemblages are finishing between about 850 and 870 on the four structures that we know, and the fifth one that I'm just now working on. Now, right, I haven't said that much about trade and contact, but it's but this is a nice beanie to end with in both of those kind of areas. And red deer are very environmentally dependent animals, more so than most mammals, and they need the right conditions in order to thrive. And in both modern samples and in archaeological samples within Europe, the largest deer are to be found in Eastern Europe and in Southeastern Europe. So kind of Serbia, Croatia, Russia, Poland are much bigger deer than you get, say, in Ireland. And you know, the reasons for this are probably quite complicated. There are various theories as to why this happened, but certainly forest cover is a big part of it. Deer love the forest, and they love vast expanses of forest too, and that's what you get, of course, in those eastern countries. And we can test this by measuring antler burrs, and there are 5 measurements that you can take on them, round the circumference, and then 4 linear measurements, and it works basically. So what you see on this diagram is Dublin is in green. This is 12th century material from Dublin. It's a wonderful sample, and it shows you that it is on the left of the diagram. Ipswich is in red, and it is to the right of Dublin, i.e. the burrs are bigger, ergo the deer are bigger, and then Hedeby is in the blue and is slightly further to the right of Ipswich. But do you see the problem with this is that Hedeby is so close to Ipswich, or to put it another way, Ipswich burrs are too big. They're bigger than they should be, and this puzzled me. Wow, puzzled all of us actually for years. Literally, we couldn't work out why this would be the case. It's not right. It's in the wrong place. Ipswich should be slightly further to the left there. And so we tried doing various things, and one of the things we tried to do was just say, well, this is something over time. You know, during the middle or late Saxon period, the deer get bigger suddenly for some reason? And that didn't really work. But what we then realized was that if we took out the material from the ditch, then we had the answer, if you like. That is the big material. It is substantially bigger than the material from Ipswich itself. So Ipswich is here in the blue, the material from the ditch in the yellow. These are the circumference measurements, and you can see that, you know, it's bigger stuff. It's genuinely bigger stuff. And this is measurement 1 of 4 that you can take, and it's even more obvious in this case that this is bigger stuff. So there are 2 possible explanations for this. One is that the material is kind of stock material, if you like. It's the end of the episode, so they had a lot of large burrs there that they just hadn't worked on. But that really doesn't work as an explanation, because you know, why didn't they work on those? You know, it doesn't work. The other explanation is that, of course, that this material, this is red deer antler that has come from the continent to Ipswich And that, I think, is a much better explanation for the whole thing. So this is a consignment of Antler that came into Ipswich after AD 825 from somewhere on the continent, and the most obvious place is Dorstadt. We've already seen the links with Dorstadt, and we can make some other links between both Hamwic and Ipswich and Dorstadt. One of them is with another comb type, the doubled connecting plate comb, quintessential Middle Saxon comb type, the best combs they ever made, really, if you like. Quite complicated things. They were a technical disaster, really. They, as you can see, they don't survive complete very often. They're normally all over the place, like this, and only the fragments survive. The teeth break off and all this kind of thing. So they were a failure, really, but they carried on making them for quite a long period of time. You find the biggest collection is in Ipswich, twice the number that you get in Hamwic, but they're well distributed across Anglo-Saxon England. There's only one place you find them at this stage on the continent, and that is Dorstadt. So that's one part of the argument. I'm very grateful to Richard Hodges for so many things, really, but also for sending me some fascinating material about more recent work on ceramics from Dorstadt. And within that, Jan de Koning, in his work on the ceramics from the Viel-Teinigen site, the market site in Dorstadt, published in 2012, he identifies a fabric which is W-11 in Arabic numerals. And he thinks this is either Ipswich ware or Thetford ware. Now, this still needs to be tested, and we're hoping we can do that, actually, with him. But at that date, it's more likely to be Ipswich ware than Thetford ware. You're talking a sort of, 830s, 840s or so, perhaps, for that. Van Es had also found small quantities of this fabric in Dorstadt, and it comes from one other site, which is a place called Leiderdorp, which is the mouth of the Rhine to the west of Dorstadt. So I'm building the case here, and the final point comes from the Stoke Quay excavations that we started with at the beginning, and the isotopes on the burials from the cemetery. There's a small cemetery there which is of EMS phase, so it's taking us back 600, 670, maybe a bit later than that, but basically in that phase. 7 of the burials are thought, on the basis of the isotopes, not to have been people who have Anglo-Saxon origins, but to have come from somewhere else. And of those, either 3 or 4 can be located to either the south of France or Dorstadt. There's a particular reason for putting them around Dorstadt in terms of isotopes. So with these various strands of evidence that I think push us towards looking at some relationship between Ipswich and Dorstadt, and indeed between Hamwic and Dorstadt as well. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And you can see it in different strands of evidence that suggest also that there was a trade in red deer antler from Dorstadt to Ipswich around somewhere around after 825. So just to finish off now, I'm running slightly late here. So just to finish off, we've taken Gabor's intermittent production. We've established that there are fixed locations from an early stage in all these places. That's certainly the case. You can say the same for Lundenwic as well. And we've also seen that production gradually increases. It ramps up over time to the point where you leave intermittent behind and you end up finally with the workshop. And I'll stop at that point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian, for that talk. Ordinarily, I guess now would be the first round of applause, so we'll have to imagine this. But I'm sure it's well earned. That's really exciting stuff from my end. I'll open up to general questions now, please. Actually, yeah. So go ahead and raise your hand. I also have a couple questions from the chat, but I'll take a question from the audience first, if there are any.
An ominous silence.
Yeah, making sure I'm not missing any. Okay, well let's go some of these questions from our chat first, then, please. Oh, I do have one from Richard Hoyle. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Richard.
Why was there such a concentration of combs in these specific areas?
Why was such a concentration of comb in these areas? Do you mean what, in these areas of these particular sites?
Yeah.
Yeah. These are production areas. I mean, one thing I didn't show you really is just how big the northern production area is in Hamwic, for example. And we don't. The answer is we don't know how big it is, but we know it goes beyond 6 dials to the south, down to site 32, and along to where the stadium is. And a few years ago, I did an assemblage from a site directly opposite the St Mary's Stadium, and that was exactly the same. That was a phase 3 assemblage, identical to a Hamwic assemblage. So the reason is that there is a fixed locale, if you like, a production area in Hamwic. Now, south of that, there is no production at all. Until you get down towards St Mary's Church, there's a gap. There's a huge gap there in the middle where there's nothing to do with bone and antler at all. And then down in the south, there are small production episodes which are early ones, the phase 2 ones, small ones around the Church of St Mary's. And there is one big one at Chapel Road. And why that one is there, I don't know. It's difficult to know why you get one assemblage of roughly 2,000 or I think 2,500 fragments of waste from a number of pits surrounding 2 buildings down there. And it's the interesting thing is that in a number of ways it's different from the northern part of the site, the northern production area. The waste from the south is different. There's far less indication actually even of cone making. They seem to be doing other things down there, but it's all a bit enigmatic, partly because I haven't worked on it very much as yet, and I need to try and get this sorted out and then see that one in relation to this one. And also I need to point out that Phil Andrews has excavated another big Hamwic site around that area, and that will be coming out this year, so that is going to be something I need to take on board as well. But basically there are areas where crafts are being produced, and these are there from the beginning as far as we can see. The earliest phase 2, phase 1, phase 2, I think they're not necessarily there. It seems to be widespread across the settlement, but by phase 3, by the time you get the handle comb, it's all happening up at the top, which is utterly fascinating. And then there are indications of something similar in Lundenwic, where most of the material is concentrated in the eastern part of the settlement, and there's very little in the west. And again, the chronology suggests that it becomes more concentrated over to the east as well. So it sort of mimics Hamwic a little bit in that respect.
Okay, thank you. So I have 2 more questions from the chat. One is from Jen. She asks, does red deer antler go out of vogue as a material because of production consumption concerns? For example, how does the time expenditure of antler compare to horn bone procurement and processing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The fact that you're procuring antler from Dorstadt at probably at a time when Dorstadt is fading. In terms of production of bone and antler and other things, the spur in Dorstadt is much the same as antler, much the same as Hamwic. Phase 4 in Dorstadt, there's an increase in production. After that, Dorstadt goes down, Lundenwic goes down. I think there are problems of supply. I think there are lots of problems of supply of antler to Hamwic. What I didn't show you on that diagram, because it starts to get a bit more complicated, Hamwic antler is too small. And the main reason for that is that it doesn't, they can't get hold of enough of it, and they don't seem to have the mechanism to be able to get it from Dorstadt in the way that you can from Ipswich. They're happier to deal with bone and to deal with these other materials. And so I think there's a problem of supply there, I think, in some extent, which is affecting all of these sites at a time when some of them are on the way down anyway.
Cool, thank you for that. And then I personally have a question for you, Ian. If you can go back to the slide where you have the graph that compared Dublin, Hedeby, and Ipswich
Yeah.
of the antlers. So Yeah, that is the one. What are the metrics on the bottom, on the x-axis? What does that measure?
That's the circumference of the burr.
Okay, and then going up?
And going up is purely, it's actually just numbers. For some reason I got 30.0 rather than 30. It's a quantity.
Right.
It's simple quantities in groups of 10. So it's how many you're dealing with.
Okay. So following along with that, because I remember you were saying, if you go down now to the slide following, that actually the big antlers at Ipswich aren't that common, except for that one ditch.
Yeah.
Right? The 4-4. And you were thinking that maybe it's kind of this shop closing up, basically. I wonder if there's a matter of like different preservation, where maybe if you had a shop closing up at Hamwic, and you had the same kind of deposit, then actually you would have gotten also another ditch at Hamwic with a whole bunch, or it had to be with a whole bunch of.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, it's interesting that they choose that ditch to deposit material. The problem with Hamwic is it has very few ditches around. There's one sort of going around it, and there are a few in the south. And I mean, that's kind of Hamwic's problem, but Hamwic's advantage as well to a certain extent. It has so few ditches, but that means that there are pits everywhere, and yet it doesn't suffer from the Ipswich problem of pits everywhere, but then late Saxon pits coming on top of Middle Saxon pits, and the whole thing being much harder to interpret. So yeah, I think they threw the pit was the place to put everything in Hamwic, whereas in Ipswich there were more ditches around, undoubtedly, and there were more. Ipswich is a bit more normal in that sense. The ditches are acting as boundaries for properties, sometimes for demarcating particular areas, if you like, as well. And Hamwic is strangely kind of short of ditches that do that. But the principles are the same. Yeah, you kind of you clear the way. You're not seemingly in too much of a hurry to just run away. I mean, I know Richard has gone now, but San Vincenzo of Altorno, when the Saracens come in 880, the antlers just all over the place. I was lucky enough to be able to dig some of that, and it was, just scattered everywhere. They didn't close down the workshops in quite the same way. They just ran for the hills, really. Whereas this is a controlled thing in Hamwic, and they know that they're going to another site as well. This is the other reason. They have a prepared site that is further over to the west.
Okay, thank you for that. So I have one more question from the chat, and then I'll give one more question to the audience if there are any. So the question in the chat says, does the archaeology show good quality bone or comb workshops versus what he calls Primark style ones? So too often we get the impression that all are working to the same level quality. This is from Neil Christie.
Yeah. Oh, it's a very good question. I like that a lot. Yeah, it shows a range of abilities and skills, if you like. I mean, there are some dreadful combs. They almost tend not to be published sometimes, but there are what you can call, if you like, apprentice pieces as well, which seem to be combs where somebody has had a go at sawing teeth to make the combs. It's a critical point, sawing the teeth. That's where everything goes wrong, and yet that's where you don't want it to go wrong. You mess it up and the tooth falls out, and that's it. You've got to take that entire segment out and do it all again. It's a disaster, really, that sort of thing. The general there's a range of quality, both at Ipswich, indeed Lundenwic as well, and Hamwic. They all have a range of quality. The handle comb can be really well made and really elegant, but it's never as good as the double-sided composite. And the as people will see when the Ipswich volume comes out, the extravagant beauties of these double connecting plate combs, and indeed the Ipswich crested comb series, which is kind of a signature series for them. Those are beautiful, beautiful combs. These are really skillfully made combs. They at Ipswich, they start using interesting riveting techniques. So they cluster all the rivets together in one place and then leave a space and then put another cluster in. They're really playing around with what they can do. They're clearly enjoying their own skills. At the other end of the scale, you've got handle combs like the one I showed from the butter market, which are awful, really, which are about the same sort of standard that I've made in my attempts to replicate them. You know, when you don't know what you're doing, really, they're actually quite atrocious, some of them. So there is certainly a range from the Primark range up to, you know, the I don't know, the M&S range or whatever beyond. There is certainly a range of quality and quantity. And I was trying to say that to a certain extent, if you have a horn comb, it's a good thing. But some of those connecting plates on those horn combs are beautifully made. The majority of them actually are pretty awful. So I think there's a slight stepping down. When you get to the handle comb, it's a stepping down, and when you get to the horn composite, it's also can be a bit of a stepping down as well.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I'll take one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to let you guys all go to your dinners and so on. If you have a bit more time, Ian. Yeah. Okay. Also, yeah. So, any more questions from the audience? Any raised hands that I can see? Okay. Brilliant. There's also an opportunity, Ian, if you want to plug your recent publication, or if you want to provide your email address. You don't have to. If anyone wants to follow up with you with any questions.
Yeah. I mean, I have to kind of. I should have put it at the end. I put, I think, just at the end, the fact that you can pick up a lot about this on academia.edu. You know, I've put a number of those up there. I can plug the fact that there is 2021 is kind of the year of Ipswich to a certain extent, in that Stoke Key has already come out. The very next CAA volume is Pam Crabtree Provisioning Ipswich. That's may now be out. It's any day now that is out. Then our volume on the worked bone and antler, which for which I've focused almost on the Middle Saxon period, which to some extent isn't as good as the late Saxon material, which is stupendous, I can only say. But that is, we've been through the peer review, we've made corrections to it, it's gone back now to EAA. Hopefully they can deal with it and get it out this year with a bit of luck. And Keith Wade has got on very well with his volume at long last, and that is the next one in the line after that for Ipswich, and that will also include Rose Broadley's work on the glass for Ipswich too. So Ipswich is suddenly going to be coming out, and there's going to be more to see about it and things to work out about it too. My email address is a ghastly one, but I'd suggest that people got in touch with Brandon, and he can give it to you. Actually, that's probably the easiest thing. I should have written it up there. It's trzaska2@outlook.com. But if you have any problems with that, then you know, go through Brandon, and Brandon will get you to me really. And I'd very much like to hear what you have to say about these things.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And that's a really good closing remark on the year of Ipswich. Also, I have a talk in the seminar series on Ipswich early on in March, or kind of middle of March as well.
Good.
I've also just put Ian's email address into the chat, so if you are eager to chase him up, that's where it is. I don't know why it's half linked. All right, so thank you again, Ian, for your lecture. Very informative. Thank you for taking the time to come out and speak to us all, and thank you, audience, for carving out an hour of your day to enjoy the lecture. So, yep, everyone clapped, and thank you all. And like I said, I'll put the recording of this on Blackboard. Okay, have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.